Victoria is the first stop on a national tour showing people what Canada's trillion-dollar debt looks like. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation is driving the debt clock. It's a truck with a digital debt counter mounted to it across the country. Now, the clock keeps track of the estimated debt the federal government is accumulating minute by minute. According to data from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the federal government isn't projected to balance its budget until 2070. Now, the Federation says that means every Canadian is responsible for paying more than $30,000 in debt, and that number just keeps rising.
Just this year, taxpayers are losing out on about $25 billion just to pay interest on the government's debt. That's $25 billion that can't be used to hire more nurses, or it's $25 billion that can't stay in taxpayers' pockets because that money is going to the bond fund managers on Bay Street just to pay interest on the debt. And that's why the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is taking the debt clock coast to coast to wake Canadians up.
Well, the group is looking for your support as it continues to call for the federal government to ring in their spending.
This is the Mike Smith Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. My guest is Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Franco, thanks for coming in.
Hey, thanks so much for having me today.
Okay, so the debt clock, the Taxpayers Federation debt clock, has now been rolled out at the BC legislature. Tell me what this thing is.
Yeah, so it's a huge U-Haul, and it's a moving truck, and we got these two big screens on each side of the truck, and it's showing the federal government's debt going up in real time. Now, you might remember the old CTF national debt clocks, because we've been bringing these debt clock tours across Canada since the 90s. Yeah. We had an older one, but we had to get a new one because the Trudeau government's $1 trillion debt broke the old screen. It just didn't have enough digits to show a full $1 trillion. So, Mike, you know what? I guess we just underestimated just how good politicians are at spending everyone else's money.
Oh, you had to get a bigger one.
Had to get a bigger one.
Debt clock. Okay, so what is the debt at right now?
It's at $1 trillion, $1 trillion, and it's going up fast.
Right. How fast is it going up?
Listen to this one. $4,500 every single second.
Wow, $4,500 a second. So when you see this debt clock, it shows the moving number. It's just ratcheting up all the time.
Yep. In real time, it's increasing $4,500 every single second, which means that it's going up about $400 million every single day. So let me tell you, this is going to be an expensive interview.
Yeah, well, it'll go up quite a bit here just as we're speaking. It also has a second kind of line item in the clock, as I remember seeing it, showing each individual's share of the national debt, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's a really scary number. I mean, $1 trillion, that's the total debt. And sometimes it's tough to kind of break down what that means at the individual level. Yeah. But so we have another little line item, and it shows your share. And right now, each Canadian, every man, woman, and child in Canada is on the hook for about $30,000 in just federal government debt. And, you know, I don't know too many people who have tens of thousands of dollars lying around to be paying their huge politicians' credit card bills. And really that's why we're doing this, because we're trying to push the federal government to rein in the massive borrowing that we've seen during the pandemic. And I know I've been hearing from so many Canadians who are worried about how we're going to pay for this unprecedented amount of spending.
Right. Speaking of Franco Terrazzano, Canadian Taxpayers Federation, the federal debt clock has been rolled out once again by the Taxpayers Federation. Okay, so you want people to be aware. It's certainly a very graphic and eye-catching tool when people see this. Like, what do people say when they walk by and they see this clock and they see those numbers rolling up like that? What do they tell you? What do they say to you?
Well, so far, the number one word that we've heard all morning is just wow. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Because I just think that most people, you know, everyone's busy with their day-to-day lives. People are worried about their own paychecks, and then they see this clock, and I think they're it's kind of eye-popping to see the $1 trillion debt and just see the numbers going up by $4,500 every single second. So the number one reaction we've gotten is a simple wow.
Wow, yeah. And $1 trillion, that's certainly a significant and historic threshold for the size of the debt right now, clicking over $1 trillion for the first time. So, you know, you've made the argument that the debt is too big, it's going up too rapidly. The government, like if the finance minister was here right now, I mean, she would make the argument this is affordable debt. If you compare it to the gross domestic product of Canada, for example, that's what they always love to compare it to. What's the GDP of the country? is this an affordable debt? Lots of people have debt. People have a mortgage on their home, so they've got big debt. But you're saying the debt's too high. They're saying it's not too high.
It's not even just that the debt is too high, which it is. I mean, $1 trillion increasing $4,500 per second, but it's also like what they're spending the money on, right? Obviously, we just had a pandemic. And let me just give you an analogy I think most Canadians would appreciate. If you have a leaky roof, you fix the leaky roof. But then you don't bring out the credit card and blow a whole bunch of money on a new flat screen, a couple new ATVs, and maybe a brand new BMW. But that's essentially what we've seen this federal government do. What we've seen the federal government budget is essentially spend more money on everything forever. But that's not a prudent way to manage taxpayers' money. And we have to remember, during this pandemic, I think many Canadians would be like, you know what, let's prioritize some resources to deal with the pandemic. But they're not doing any prioritization. We have seen no savings in other areas of the budget.
Okay, 30 seconds here, Franco. The debt clock right now has been rolled up outside the BC legislature. You're on tour with this thing, right? Where is it going next?
Yeah, we're going coast to coast all across Canada. Our next stop is going to be in Vancouver. So we're leaving Victoria this afternoon, heading across, taking the ferry, which I can't wait to be on. And then, next press conference is going to be Vancouver, right downtown, tomorrow morning.
Thanks a lot for coming in.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
All right, Franco Terrazzano there from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Keep an eye out for that debt clock. That's coming to Vancouver next.
Bank of Canada has printed about $370 billion out of thin air. Much of what it's buying up is Government of Canada bonds. So it really seems like Ottawa is financing a good chunk of its deficits with a printing press, which means that Ottawa is financing a good chunk of its deficits by eroding the value of your money. That's the inflation tax. The massive government borrowing and tax hikes during the middle of the pandemic. We've been talking about the inflation tax. The government central bank has printed $370 billion, right? Sure, there's many things that influence prices, but one of the key things here is that you have the government central bank printing dollars out of thin air, and of course the government can't print houses out of thin air, so you have this inevitable problem where you have too many dollars chasing too few goods because the government's printing press has been on overdrive during the pandemic.
Hey everyone, Canadian Taxpayers Federation's National Debt Clock Tour is here in Abbotsford, and the debt is still going up by $4,500 every single second. Stay tuned, our next stop is in Kamloops tonight. Government debt and now ballooning cost of living. Right behind me, the debt clock. $1 trillion in debt federally, going up $4,500 every single second. And now we learn that the consumer price index, the measure of inflation, has gone up 5.7% year over year. That's 3 decades high inflation. So we're seeing a high cost of government in Canada seeping into a high cost of living in Canada. And here's how. During the pandemic, the federal government central bank has printed up about $370 billion out of thin air by buying financial assets like Government of Canada debt. So that sure seems like Ottawa is using the printing press to finance a good chunk of its deficits, which means that Ottawa is using the printing press, devaluing your dollars so that they can run massive deficits. That's the inflation tax, because the more dollars that the central bank prints up to buy Government of Canada debt, the less that your dollars buy.
Well, good morning. Welcome to the early edition on this March 17th, St. Patrick's Day morning. But right now, some special guests have arrived in town, and I'm certainly a champion or a cheerleader for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I can still remember the first time I was exposed to the idea of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I'd never heard of them. Arrived in town with a van and a trailer being towed behind him. And he was on his way driving across the country, coast to coast. Had started in Victoria, was coming through town, and thought he might like to connect with us. So there he was out in front of the radio station with a van, and then this trailer. And on the back of the trailer was what he called the National Debt Clock. Franco Terrazzano, who is the National Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation today, is on the road. And is parked down on the street right here in front of the radio station. Mr. Terrazzano, good morning to you and welcome to town.
Hey, good morning, and thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So listen, I've only seen pictures of this new vehicle, but I'm just intrigued when I compare the National Debt Clock that Williamson used to drive around being towed behind a car, and then you suddenly ran out of room on the National Debt Clock because it could. So now you've got this cube van, this truck, because that's the only billboard you could get that would be big enough to carry the new National Debt Clock.
Yeah, that's right. We had to get a brand new, very large U-Haul type of truck. You can't miss it. We got the Canadian flag on it, and we have these two massive digital screens that is showing the debt going up in real time. And as you pointed out, we had to get a new one because the government's debt broke the old one. We didn't have enough digits to display the $1 trillion debt on the old clock, so we had to get the new one. And right now, you can watch in downtown Kelowna the $1 trillion federal government debt going up by $4,500 every single second.
You know, Klein and I were talking about that number just a short while ago, and I was saying, I wonder if we'd ever see the day that we've kind of got our fiscal house in order, and that in fact the National Debt Clock now shows that the numbers are reducing by $4,500 a second. Would we ever see that number going the other way? I don't think that we ever would, but it's a nice dream.
You know, Phil, we launched the tour in Monday in Victoria, and since then we've been on the road nonstop, going through the big cities, the medium-sized cities, and even the small towns. And everywhere we stop, we get two reactions. Reaction number one is wow, right? Just wow. Can't believe we're this far in debt. Number two, almost jokingly, is exactly that reaction you just made. A simple question is, well, when are we ever going to see this clock ticking down? So we've heard that a lot on the road already.
Well, you know, I've admired your financial acumen, I guess if you want to call it that. Certainly every time that we've had the pleasure of talking with you, it seems like you have a very sharp pencil, attached permanently to your right hand. And you do have a way with numbers and a way of vocalizing what's going on with this country fiscally, financially. And I think I can still remember that you suggested that even if we could start reducing the debt right now, that it would be, what was it you said, 2070?
Oh, 2070. That is when we can expect the next balanced budget federally under the current government plan. Under the current government's trajectory, we would not see a balanced budget until 2070. But the bad news doesn't end there. It would take at least another 2 decades to finally pay off the debt after that, to somewhere around 2090 under the status quo. Now, let me just break down some of the numbers that you'll see on the truck today. More than $1 trillion in debt. That number is going up by $4,500 a second, or about $400 million a day. And just underneath the total debt, we have a sign that says your share of the debt, what you owe personally to the federal government, and it's more than $30,000 that each Canadian is on the hook for.
So, I mean, I find the number astronomical, not self-defeating, because I'm applauding you profoundly for bringing this to put it in front of the Canadian public in such a graphic way. I'm sure that the reaction of the Canadian public is people that are going by the van, people that are talking to you, their immediate reaction is, I had no idea.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That really is. And that's why we're doing this, because we think that it's our objective as step number one, just to raise awareness, just to sound the alarm over the $1 trillion debt. And that's why we're taking it coast to coast. As I mentioned, we kicked it off in Victoria this week, and we expect to be all the way over to the Atlantic Ocean sometime mid-April. Now, we do expect a federal budget to be coming pretty soon. We've heard first week of April, and we're hoping to have the debt clock around Ottawa right in time for the budget. So we'll be definitely sounding the alarm as the finance minister gets ready to table her big deficit budget.
So you mean you're going to have a debt freedom protest? You're going to park right there on the front steps or on the front door of the legislative building? Are you going to be there and raise a little fiscal hell?
I like the way you put that. But we're going to try to get as close as we can, just to make sure all the parliamentarians, all the politicians in Ottawa know just exactly how much debt that they've brought Canadian taxpayers into.
Don't you wish, in your heart of hearts, that Canadians could be as angry and be as frustrated with this as they were with vaccine mandates? I guess, I look at what went on in Ottawa for week after week after week, and national, they had to call out and put in place the Emergencies Act. But wouldn't it be nice if Canadians would respond as positively or as negatively? I don't know which word I'm going to look for here, but don't you just wish that Canadians would become as angry with what's being done to them fiscally as what's happening?
Well, Phil, I'm starting to hear that. I mean, even since we first started talking, when I first got this national role, I've seen the attention to the debt, attention to the inflation increase among Canadians. And the reason is I do think that inflation is becoming so bad, 30-year high, right? 30-year high inflation. I think people are understanding the tie between this massive government borrowing, this massive government debt, and the rising cost of living, right? Because you had the government financing a huge chunk of its deficits through the printing press, meaning they printed up a whole bunch of new dollars, making the dollars and cents in our bank accounts buy less and less and less. So I do feel that Canadians are waking up to this. And remember, it took time in the 90s. We were taking the old debt clock coast to coast in the 90s, raising awareness. It took time, but then even at the time, you had Finance Minister Paul Martin saying, that damn clock. So hopefully we can continue to put some pressure.
That damn clock. Well, it's parked right out here on Bernard in front of AM 1150 at 435 Bernard. Franco Terrazzano is going to be there. Listen, something that I do want to touch with you on quickly. We have an appetite in this country for giving billions of dollars to huge national corporations that make nothing but profits, but we continue to seemingly buy their vote, buy their jobs. It just seems that the corporations are at the trough, and the government of Canada is more than willing to feed them billions of dollars.
Yeah, it makes me sick. Quite honestly, it makes me sick. Just especially when you think of the struggles that so many working Canadians have gone through over the last 2 years. Phil, we did a whole bunch of digging, and we found that the federal government has given about $18 billion worth of corporate welfare announcements between 2017 and 2021. And when I mean corporate welfare, I mean like the $295 million to the Ford Motor Corporation. I'm not talking about the government, the help that went to the restaurant down the street or the gym down the street to keep their lights on during government restrictions. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the $295 million to the Ford Motor Corporation. It really puts a pit into my stomach when I know that the federal government has announced about $18 billion in those types of corporate welfare.
Well, that is the voice of Franco Terrazzano. He is parked right in front of us here at 435 Bernard. He's going to be parked there through the morning. He's looking to have an opportunity to talk to Canadians about the tax bill, the indebtedness, the national debt clock. Chris Sims, I believe, is also joining him for part of this cross-Canada tour. Certainly somebody that we've welcomed to this radio station often and always listen closely when she talks about the national debt, or more to the point, with a different focus, the BC government debt and what's going on over there with John Horgan. Anyway, they're out in front. We hope you'll come by and say hello and take a good long look at the national debt clock.
The federal debt ballooned during the COVID-19 pandemic, and to bring the point home, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation brought its National Debt Clock tour to Kelowna, stopping in at the Packing Horse Pub Wednesday night.
Well, the issue that we see on the pandemic spending is that we didn't see prioritization. I think many Canadians understand that if you have an issue like this, redirect resources. But we haven't seen that level of prioritization, and we haven't seen the federal government find savings in other areas of the budget. And we have to remember that even before the pandemic, in 2018, the federal government was spending all-time highs.
Among those who showed up to hear from Terrazzano and snap a picture with the debt clock was Kelowna Lake Country MP Tracy Gray. A hot topic right now in BC and across the country is fuel taxes, as we pay record prices for gasoline.
The Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we're calling on the federal government to scrap its carbon tax, but we're also calling on premiers like Premier John Horgan to provide some much needed tax relief, whether that is reducing provincial fuel taxes or, of course, scrapping the provincial carbon tax here in British Columbia. Now, we're actually seeing other jurisdictions provide their taxpayers with relief. South Korea, India, Poland, reducing gas taxes. Even President Joe Biden down south, he's considering gas tax relief. So while Ottawa is sticking us with a higher tax bill, other countries are providing their citizens with much needed relief.
The CTF launched its National Debt Clock tour earlier this week in Victoria, and Terrazzano said it was nice to be interacting with people again after so many months of pandemic restrictions. In Kelowna, Cindy White, Castanet.
Well, a hard-hitting reminder today of our growing federal debt as the Canadian Taxpayers Federation brought its national debt clock to the Okanagan on its cross-Canada tour.
Right behind me, you see our big national debt clock, and it's showing the federal government's $1 trillion debt increasing in real time. The federal debt is increasing by about $400 million every single day, which means that each Canadian is already on the hook for more than $30,000 in federal government debt.
How about that? The debt clock making its way around downtown Kelowna today, displaying how quickly our national debt is increasing. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation says while COVID-19 did add to our debt with more than $500 billion being spent on pandemic and lockdown subsidies, the government was already at an all-time spending high prior to the virus outbreak. In fact, according to data published by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the government isn't projected to balance its books until the year 2070. Many are understandably concerned seeing the debt clock and just how fast Canadian debt is growing.
Kind of makes me think, like, is there going to be like an end in sight? Is there going to be a time in my life where that number is going to go down? It's a bit scary to think about.
Well, I think we better stop spending that kind of money. Tell our governments to give it a rest, you know.
The Tax Federation first introduced the debt clock in the 90s as a way to fight against large deficits and overall government debt.
Welcome to Fayteen Live. We're actually going live on my Facebook page and on Twitter and on YouTube, I think, as well. But this is so much fun. Live from the road, I have none other than Franco Terrazzano, the National Director, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. So, Franco, why don't you give our viewers a quick wave here and give us an update on where you are, what you're doing, and what's all the background noise there about?
Well, hey, everyone. I'm talking live to you from beautiful but windy Lethbridge, Alberta. We're doing the National Debt Clock Tour, just driving all across Canada, coast to coast, showing all Canadians the federal government's $1 trillion debt problem. We started in Victoria earlier this week on Monday. We're kicking off the Alberta portion today, and we're going to keep going till we hit the Atlantic Ocean.